Good afternoon, everyone. And if you are in another time zone, good morning and good evening to you all. Thank you for being here. This is a session on inferential reading strategies for primary school children. We will discuss how to simplify reading and comprehension for primary students, making reading fun and engaging. We'll talk about some pre work that is required for reading before we actually teach them to handle the text, the stages of reading and comprehension, and of course, the focus will be on inferential reading strategies. We'll talk about responding to questions and the techniques to develop critical thinking skills in children. We'll also discuss some hands on activities that can be conducted during your online sessions or perhaps in classroom teaching. Someone said, the best thing about books is that sometimes they have pictures. And if you see the picture on the screen, it speaks 1,000 words. Children are little storytellers. When they're given visuals like these, they really enjoy telling stories based on what they see. It gives them an opportunity to look closely at the facial expressions of people and look at the behavior, look at the environment, the setting in the picture, and then talk about what they see. Attaining fluency in speaking skills is really the first step in attaining fluency in reading. So the reading and comprehension focus requires engagement at first so that children get involved in an immersive learning experience. From there, we work towards fluency in reading, where it can be done in a sort of jigsaw activity setting where everyone reads parts of a story and then it comes together in class when they get to discuss it in groups or in pairs with each other, or perhaps read out loud in the classroom individually. And then we will talk about understanding and how to help students interpret the text in their own different ways through a critical reading and analyzing process and respond to the questions and the tasks at hand. Children don't read in a vacuum. Brainstorming for ideas as a pre-work process to reading is really important and an integral tool towards helping them develop analytical skills. And then, of course, peer facilitation, helping them collaborate with each other, connect, form ideas together, and expand on what they know, expand on their prior knowledge, and then have their peers contribute to that as well. Linking the topic and their learning to their daily life experiences really helps them process and internalize the information. And of course, asking students to predict the text from the title that we give them is important, because let me give you an example of a text which is based on an earthquake. If they're reading about an earthquake, you might want to ask them if they've experienced something like that in their own life and have them tell their own little stories about it as the first step towards reading about earthquakes. And then we ask children to formulate their own questions based on what they've read. You can get a fairly good idea of how strong their grip on the text is by the questions that they can form on it. The reading and comprehension strategies that we will discuss are from Oxford Progressive English book, which has been revised this year. This is the second edition, and it incorporates an integrated approach to ELT with follow-up activities for all 4 core language skills. The idea is to bring in texts from different subjects so that children develop the life skills and a wider breadth of knowledge that is required to handle all subjects, because their examinations in most subjects are taken in English. It becomes a skill throughout their academic life. There are multi-sensory tools in the Oxford Progressive Second English with a special focus on grammar, vocabulary, and punctuation. There's assessment for learning tools as well, because of course teachers don't want to wait till the end of year to find out that some students have been left out of the learning process. They can identify the need gaps really closely and nip them in the bud if they monitor students' learning as they go along. So there are assessment for learning tests for that. There are also supplementary tests in the teacher's guide. So teachers don't actually have to sit and make their own tests or their lesson plans. There's a breakup of timings for the lesson plans, and step-by-step strategies to handle each unit. The Oxford Progressive English Revision involves new texts, updated texts from contemporary literature. There's extended vocabulary with a word pool so that teachers know and students understand exactly which words, what kind of vocabulary is being targeted in each text. And then there are curriculum themes which are linked to the Pakistan National Curriculum Framework. We've got extended tests for students who can handle a higher level of learning, perhaps more challenging tasks. And of course, there's redesigned artwork, which is much more fascinating and engaging to look at. The stages of a reading lesson involve three broad categories. So we've got before reading. The comprehension strategies that we apply before reading might be very different from what we do while monitoring reading in class during the reading process. Now we've got pre-teaching vocabulary when they before students actually start reading a text. It might be a significant step to pre-teach the vocabulary that they will be reading, because when a text is given to them and they see quite a few difficult words in it, it might be very daunting for them. So the idea is to teach the vocabulary before they actually start reading the text. After reading, students might want to handle the post-reading tasks through a process of comprehension strategies that we will discuss in this session. What does pre-work for reading really involve? Right before we introduce a text to students, we might want to engage them in the process before we give them the task of reading. So hook the students with a hypothetical situation or questions, such as, what would you do in a situation where you're caught in a natural disaster? Have you ever been through a natural disaster? Students might come up with ideas such as a heavy rainfall or floods that they might have experienced. They might talk about a snowfall. They might talk about a volcanic eruption that they've seen in a video. Having engaged them in that kind of discussion, teachers will then frame questions based on the 5 W's. Where do earthquakes normally take place? What are earthquakes? When can we expect an earthquake? Where can we expect an earthquake? Why do earthquakes take place? And then link that to their experience or someone else's experience that they know of, that they might want to talk about. Pre-teach the vocabulary that is connected to earthquakes through a process of elicitation and contextualizing. So, for example, if you want to teach the word excruciating, students might not know the exact meaning of the word excruciating, but they might be able to understand its implication if you give them an example in a sentence, such as, I had excruciating pain last night, or I had an excruciating headache last night. They would get a general idea that it's something extreme, it's something severe or serious. And once you've contextualized it in a sentence, you can elicit some words from the students. You could also do a little snowball activity where if it's an easier word like beautiful, for example, they might be able to give you synonyms for beautiful. And someone would come up with attractive, another person would come up with stunning or nice to look at, or they might give you a word like gorgeous. And once students start giving you words like that, you could ask them to write them all down on a piece of paper, crumple it into a snowball and throw it at each other. It doesn't hurt. It's a fun activity in the class, and it can be done in every lesson for 5 minutes at the start of the lesson, during, or towards the end of the lesson. And then when they exchange the snowballs, the person who catches a snowball gets to open it and read it, and that's how they expand their vocabulary and learn from each other. When we read texts with them, before we actually start reading text, it's important to show them visuals to catch on to clues and then reason somewhat about the setting and what's going on in this picture. And it's really a process of making informed guesses. That's where we start teaching children to look at the hidden meanings in texts just by looking at the pictures first. And the Oxford Progressive English books give you a lot of visuals that support the text that is contained in the units. And then the idea of looking for key points. What is it that we will actually read in the text? What will be the important information that we can expect from the text? So those are the steps for pre-reading. And then we can introduce them to the idea of inference. What is inference? It is identifying what isn't being said. So there are hidden meanings in text and sentences, and hidden meanings in the behavior and the emotion of characters. This starts the process of analytical thinking for children. If you look at the picture on the screen, the girl is looking at a certain way at the chocolate chip cookies, and she seems to be very tempted. She's almost drooling at them. Children might be asked, what does this picture tell us? They would, of course, know that the girl can't wait for the cookies. This might also tell them that she really likes chocolate chip cookies. You might want to ask them, who do you think has baked these cookies for her? Are they home baked? Are they from somewhere else? They're not in a box. They're in a baking tray. They are obviously freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. If she's looking at chocolate chip cookies rather excitedly, does that tell us that she has had them before? Obviously, she would like something that she has had before. So there are lots of different ways in which we can elicit information just by looking at a picture like that. Students are, of course, making informed guesses about what they see in the picture, and then through a process of reasoning would come to a conclusion about what they see. Inference can also be taught through dialogue. So if you look at the picture on the screen, this is about a family trying to resolve a conflict. So a boy has behaved rather badly, and the grandfather tries to resolve the conflict between these two children by requesting an apology from the boy. This picture, and if you read this dialogue and also look at the facial expressions of the children, this entire piece, this little story here, which is presented in the form of dialogues within speech bubbles, tells us that we're learning about social skills here, about acceptable manners in society. We are learning about family values and how we're expected to behave with each other, how we can set off some people with our behavior when we get reactions from them that are negative. We know that we've done something wrong or perhaps offended someone. And then there's a process of conflict resolution. How do we resolve problems that we face daily in our lives? Understanding characters through this process is important for children so that they can look at how characters behave differently. If they change their behavior, they might change the reactions or responses. They might be able to affect the reactions and responses of other people. And also, of course, punctuating dialogue, because when we write down speech in the form of speech bubbles, children learn how to punctuate dialogue in these bite-sized ways, with each block showing you where the commas are placed, where the question marks are placed. So it's a pretty interesting way of laying out a story for children and helping them look for clues and reason out what is being spoken about. This also helps develop higher order thinking skills in children, the critical thinking skills or the analytical skills that are needed to process and internalize information and texts. So the idea is to introduce children to multiple meanings in a text, in a sentence, or understand literal and figurative language so that they know that language can be manipulated in different ways, that sometimes there's a play upon words, that everything doesn't have to be taken at face value. There might be some hidden meanings in words. Some words have multiple meanings. Some sentences are multi-layered, and we've got to scratch the surface and understand those hidden meanings and what the writer really wants us to know. It also helps children conceptualize different outcomes of a story. So what other outcomes do you think the story could have If a character were to change his or her behavior, would the outcome of the story change? Students can also be encouraged to retell a story in their own individual ways. And then there's vocabulary that we might want to pre-teach by a process of elicitation, which we've already discussed. We could also do a bit of role play, because children love animated ways of telling a story. They love reenacting stories, and it's a process of embodied learning in the classroom where they get to practice enunciation, they get to practice the different intonation that is required to tell stories, and perhaps make it wacky or make it dramatic in class, because that will, of course, be fun and engaging for students. And it involves all those passive learners who might be reluctant to read. If they can just see a story being acted out in the class, they might get involved in the reading process as well. Picture stories are important in teaching vocabulary too, because sometimes it's not a very good idea to explain the meaning of terms such as emergency relief. But if they can see a picture of it on the screen during online teaching, or if they see a picture of it in the book, you can help contextualize what emergency relief really means. In a snap, they can understand, if they see the picture, what emergency relief goods might mean. Or you could contextualize it by giving them an example in a sentence. And then, of course, the idea of teaching vocabulary is to constantly reinforce it to help with retention. And that is done through vocabulary patterns. So if we're targeting a certain vocabulary, it will appear very often in a text in our Oxford Progressive English books, so that students get not only introduced to a word, but it can be embedded in their vocabulary through frequent usage. The different levels of reading and comprehension that we're going to discuss involve literal, inferential, and critical. Literal literal reading is, of course, very straightforward. The questions to ask for that are what, when, where. So, for example, if you look at the little text on the screen, it says Samba lived on a big island in Malaysia and he loved to paint. The questions that a teacher might ask is, where did Samba live? He lived on a big island. When we ask questions like that, it's important to ask students to answer in full sentences, because if they get used to just giving you phrases like big island, they might not be able to frame those answers when they begin to write. So encourage them to answer in full sentences when you ask them questions like that. And this question is obviously very straightforward. It's literal. Who is the story about? This story is about Samba. And then we move on to inferential reading. It says here, have you seen the pictures in his parents' house? Have you seen his mural in the doctor's clinic? He's not just good, he's very fast. He painted a picture of his 3 brothers in just half an hour. What can we infer about Samba from this? We can infer that he loves painting. We can infer that he is passionate about painting. He's great at painting. We can infer that perhaps he's making an impact on other people through his paintings. And then we move on to the critical reading process, where it says, I want my pictures to look real. How can I draw a drop of water on the end of a leaf? Now, Samba is asking himself a question. There is a problem. What problem is Samba facing? How do you think Samba is going to resolve this problem? That requires individual interpretation and some level of analytical ability in students to come up with their own individualistic answers. Examples of reading skills. So, for example, if you're teaching literal or figurative reading skills, we might want to give them examples like this one, I'm dying of thirst, and then ask a close-ended question, such as, when someone says, I'm dying of thirst, are they really dying? And students will say, no. This is a yes or no answer, a close-ended question. Why are they saying I'm dying of thirst? What does it show us? A little bit of inference is required to scratch the surface and understand that they're exaggerating to show their desperation. If we have a statement like he gritted his teeth and walked on, You might want to ask the students, when do people grit their teeth? You might want to demonstrate what gritting teeth really means, and then move on to, once you've demonstrated it and helped them understand the meaning of the word gritting teeth, or the phrase gritting teeth, you can then move on to asking them, under what circumstances do people do this? They could be doing this when they're really angry or frustrated. They could do this perhaps when they're feeling unwell. They could do this when their teeth are chattering, they're shivering for some reason, if it's cold or they have a temperature. So there are different reasons for which we could grit our teeth. And understanding the different reasons is really the multi-layered meanings of a sentence. Critical thinking is an example of critical thinking. A critical thinking question would be, or a higher order thinking skill question would be, what will happen if there is no water left on Earth? And that is a question that can be answered in hundreds of different ways. The idea is not to stick to one answer, but allow students to think as deeply and as widely about a question like that as possible, come up with as many answers as they possibly can, and perhaps even argue against themselves. You might want to stop and ask students to defend their opinions. So when they give you an answer, don't just take it at face value. Ask them for an example, ask them for evidence, tell them, ask them, why do you say that? Or why do you think that? And let them come up with reasons so that they understand that when they make a statement or give you their opinion, that they have to defend it with logic and reason. When we talk about literal comprehension techniques, it might be a good idea to let students read a text, or perhaps even before reading a text, look at the title and tell you what they might expect from the text. So going back to the example of the earthquake, which I think is in book 5 of Oxford Progressive English 2nd edition, there is a lengthy text on earthquakes. And when students read the title, you might want to ask them, what do you think this text is going to tell us about earthquakes? Can you think of 5 questions that you might want answered? So they might come up with questions such as, where do earthquakes normally take place? How are earthquakes measured? Why do we experience earthquakes? What impact do earthquakes make on us? And through those questions, students will get a fairly good idea of what the text will contain. This is also a process of engaging them in identifying with the text, relating to the text before they start reading it. And then once they have read the text in groups or in pairs in the classroom, or even individually out loud with the class, they might want to reiterate the key information. What do you think are the main points in this text? What are the points that are relevant to the questions that you might be asked at the end of the text? You might also want to help them conceptualize different ways of ending the story, or different ways of dealing with the text. So if the earthquake that has been discussed has measured 5.5 on the Richter scale, you might want to ask them, now if this earthquake was actually 7.5 on the Richter scale, how would it impact the people around? Students are being asked to think about different outcomes to a text or a story, and come up with new ways of thinking about what they're reading. And then we move on to the 3 R's, which is recitation, revise, and recall. When they get to recite in class aloud, when they get to read out a story, they will start picking out the main information or the key points. Some students are really shy to read out loud in the classroom. And what we can then do is have a process of them reading in groups, just quietly to their peers, or reading in pairs with each other, and then the teacher can go around, sit with different groups and listen closely to the reading just to understand which of them are reluctant readers, which of them are struggling to read a text. And that really is the process of differentiation, where we sit with students who are struggling readers and help them through individually and nip the problem in the bud rather than realizing later that they have been unable to get through the text. The process of revising really means that we've read it once and then we give it a second shot and read it again, or a third time, to get not just the gist, but the details of the text as well, and how much information from it can we recall. And this is where the peers, collaboration with peers is really important, because they can help each other out if they share the information, if they exchange ideas, or add to each other's main points. We can also have a process of, we can also have a jigsaw reading technique here, where if the text is lengthy, then each group doesn't have to read the entire text. We can divide it into paragraphs and give one paragraph to each of the groups. And then they get to summarize what they've read for the rest of the class so that it all comes together really well, like pieces of a puzzle. Examples of inference would be, Yasmin said in a small voice, "I don't like this." You might want to ask the students, what is the literal meaning of the word small? What does it really mean? When we talk in a small voice, we're talking in a low voice or a quiet voice. That's the literal meaning. But under what circumstances do we talk in a low voice or a quiet voice? And you might get different answers for that. There will be students who will say we talk in a low voice when we don't want people to hear, so it might be a secret. Or we talk in a low voice because we are scared or nervous. We might even talk in a low voice when we're feeling unwell, or we're really angry at something. So there are different reasons why people talk in a small voice, and that is inferential reading, when we can catch the implications of a word or an expression in a sentence. Another example is Anwar went to sleep much before his bedtime. Now, of course, the literal meaning is that he's gone to sleep before his bedtime. He's gone to sleep rather early. But what are the different reasons someone can go to sleep very early? They might be angry or frustrated and they just want to drop everything and go off to sleep. Or they might be feeling unwell. That's why he's gone off to sleep early, because he's feeling unwell. Perhaps he has a rather important examination the next day, so he wants to get more than a full night's sleep. And that's why he's gone to sleep early before his bedtime. Sometimes we go off to sleep early because we are really, really tired. So there are different reasons for that. That really is the critical thinking process that we want to involve students in. The next example is, instead of answering the question, the man went quiet. Why do you think people would refrain from answering a question? Perhaps he's offended by the question. Perhaps he doesn't know the answer. Perhaps he has lost an argument. Again, there are different ways of answering the same question. So if children are encouraged to think about different ways and sometimes even argue against themselves, so share an answer and then they can backtrack and perhaps give you another answer. That would really involve them in a critical thinking process. Reading prompts are also important. There is an example here from Book 2, Unit 7, Lesson 4, where there is a picture story which is backed up with these speech bubbles, a bit of grammar tasks, and then there's highlighted expressions there. The sequence of the picture story is important. Sometimes we can ask students to place the pictures in the right sequence. When we read the little bit that's given in the picture story, we can get a very good idea of what the setting is like. When they look at pictures, students can help establish the setting. In the process of writing, they could write little sentences about what they see. So if they see green trees, if they see a nice shining sun, if they see chirping birds, then you know that it's a happy setting and they can write little sentences about the setting. Or if it's a drab and dreary setting with dark clouds, a dark night, a creepy night, they can write that down as well. The idea is to put down a setting once they've read, to be able to understand the setting in a story so that when they are producing their own little stories, that will help them in their writing process as well. These act as building blocks to writing. And then, of course, looking at characters very closely, studying their facial expressions, recognizing how they're acting, understanding their behavior, understanding the motives behind their behavior, understanding the impact that their behavior makes on other people, and how other people respond and react to them. Those are very important aspects of teaching inference as well. Then there are conflicts in every story, unless, of course, it's a straightforward, informative writing story. You would have a twist in a story, in a text. Usually you will find a twist or a problem that's been introduced. And then students will dig deeper into the problem and figure out why it's really there and what can be done about that. A discussion on those lines is also important in helping them analyze different ways in which conflicts can be resolved, and also why conflicts are an important part of a story, where there's rising action, and it really sparks the curiosity of the reader. It builds suspense. How do writers build suspense for the readers? Why would readers really be interested in finding out how this story ends? And then helping them towards recognizing that there is a resolution to every story. It might be good or bad, and they can visualize different outcomes as well and retell the story in their own different ways. So just a bit of recap for the pre-work, the reading task, and post-reading tasks. For a story like the kind that you see, a picture story, like the one that you see on the screen, we could have questions based on the visuals themselves. There are links, there's an element that links both the pictures. If you look at the setting closely, the setting really is the same in both, or similar in both the pictures. There's a character that is the same in both the pictures and doing exactly the same thing. So you might want to ask, how are the pictures similar? And how are these pictures different? What is the man doing in the first picture? What is the woman doing in the second picture? Why do you think the boy is on his busy on his tablet in the first picture, and the same boy wearing the same clothes is busy again on his tablet in the second picture? Obviously, this picture is telling us something about the behavior of this character. He's oblivious to his surroundings. He's very involved in his screen time, and he's not interested in helping his dad who's working on the car, or helping his mother who's working outside picking flowers. That could be the start of a story that children might want to write about themselves and what they do to help out in the household. Or they might want to write a story about this character and what he is all about. So provide them with clues from the pictures. Don't give them answers, because really the answers have to come from the students through a process of elicitation. You want them to construct the knowledge for themselves. You want them to be able to think critically about the stories that they read or the visuals that they see, rather than being told how to think and what to write. They are, then you want to enable them, take them through a process of being able to identify the feelings of characters and look very closely. If it's not a visual, if it's a text, then they might want to look very closely at the emotive language used to understand what is being said about character. Character analysis is a very important part of inferential reading, because it helps children understand real people in real societies where they live. And then, of course, when they read the text, to be able to summarize the main idea of it is an important part of understanding and processing the text. Here's an example of a comprehension task that lays out the understanding of the text in a very simple way through a graphic organizer called a spidergram. Here, when children have read about a river, a story about a river, they would put down all the key points that they have read about, all the features of the river and what all has been said about it in the text, in these little circles that you see in the picture. And when they've done that, they have neatly organized all the key information that is required to answer the questions. And then they move on to 3 very short questions about the mole's feelings. So when he saw the river, the mole was feeling. Are they able to identify the feelings of the mole in 3 different ways and write them down? Once they've done this task, it'll be very easy for them to recall the information because it is all put down there in a neat little graphic summary. We're going to recap some of the reading strategies that we've talked about. So the first step to introducing a text to students would be to enable them to predict what the text might be all about. What do they want to learn about that title? And can they come up with their own questions based on it, even before they start reading the text? Then we would link it to their experiences, ask them to narrate something about something they might have experienced, something they might have felt, and talk about it in their own ways, individual ways. And then we would help them skim through a text just to gather the main idea or the main, say, the gist of what is being explained in the text, ask their own questions, and help them, give them a springboard with the 5 W's so that they can frame questions starting with the prompts: what, where, when, who, why, and then throw in an H as well with the how, which will help them with critical thinking questions. Next, we move on to scanning the text for key points. And if they have the textbook in front of them, it might help to underline just phrases, not long sentences, but just the phrases that they feel are important points in the text. And then help them summarize those key points. If they can retell the story, then you know that they have understood it. And even if a few students in the class can retell the story, then the others will benefit from it as well. If you're teaching online, you might want to ask them to summarize the story in the chat box. In online teaching, in order to keep the students engaged, occupied, and involved in the learning process, it's important to keep the chat box busy. When they get to contribute verbally or by writing in the chat box, then they will stay with you, they'll stay on board. Otherwise, many teachers have found that it's quite tricky to keep children on board, keep children constantly engaged in online classes. And making connections with daily life experiences is really a very important part of the process, because if students don't identify with what they're reading, if they can't relate to the characters or the events, then it's really quite hard to help them internalize the information. I hope you found this session useful. If you have any questions or comments, I would be very happy to take them now. Thank you very much for being here.